And Daniel Simmons, talk about the role of wind energy in the total U.S. energy portfolio.
Okay, wind produces about 2.9%. In 2011, wind produced about 2.9% of all electricity generated. It'll be higher than that this year because of, as Denise was talking about, installations have increased. And so wind is a growing part of our electricity portfolio. One of the challenges for wind, however, is what everyone understands about wind, which is it only produces electricity when the wind is blowing. And that's not, unfortunately, how we use electricity. The way we use electricity is it's instant on. It's, you want some electricity in the middle of the night, but you want a lot more during the day. On these hot summer days that we've had when we have high demand, we're all using air conditioning, and at those times wind isn't blowing as much. So that is the real challenge for wind, and that's something that the production tax credit really doesn't help with, is developing the technologies so that we could store the wind. Instead, what the production tax credit does is it pays the producers for producing. And what matters is that we have some electricity all the time, and then that electricity can be scaled and increased to meet demand in the middle of the day. And for wind, that's a real challenge because, yes, ma'am.
So from your perspective, should this tax credit continue?
No, we don't believe that this tax credit should continue, but we don't support tax credits for other energy sources either.
What about oil?
That oil doesn't need the tax incentives and
any longer.
Any longer or period, honestly, because now it is also important to understand that the magnitudes are far different between what there is for per unit of energy from what wind does to what oil and gas does. In 2011, wind received, according to the Energy Information, in total federal subsidies, about $56 per kilowatt hour, but coal or natural gas received subsidies of about 54 cents. So you're talking about orders of magnitude different in the amount of subsidies for the amount of energy produced.
I guess we also have to go back in time, don't we, in terms of development of oil energy, development of coal, and the extent to which they received tax credits in order to develop and grow and become the strength within the economy that they currently are.
Somewhat sure. I mean, one of the coal and oil production, especially oil production, but that even had a head start, far ahead of, because we were first producing oil in the mid-1800s, 1860s, when there was the first oil wells drilled, and through the 1800s. And you didn't even have the Internal Revenue Code like it is at all today until the early part of the century. So it had a head start when there were no subsidies. There are some, but those should be done away with because, these sources of energy should compete on their own. And the people that should be deciding are, us Americans. If you want to pay for wind energy, fantastic. You should pay for it. You should have that opportunity. And if you want to pay for other sources of energy that might be more expensive, you can do that too.
Daniel Simmons, he's Director of Regulatory and State Affairs at the Institute for Energy Research. Daniel Simmons, how do you see that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, on the jobs issue, since 2003, about 20% of all new private sector jobs were in the oil and gas industry, according to an article in the Wall Street Journal. So that industry has grown because of new technologies. That's why we have more oil production, more natural gas production. And, this has been in a tough economic environment. So there has been job increases. And one of the things to understand, too, about the production tax credit is that it's 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour produced when the price of electricity, the wholesale price of electricity, is around frequently about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. In other words, this is a tax credit that's worth 40 to 50% of the cost of the electricity. In other words, we're not going out like when we're talking about the some incentives, some tax incentives for oil and gas, we're not giving them $40 a barrel in tax credits. It's pennies on the dollar, and I don't support those either. But what I'm saying is this is a very large amount of the wholesale price of electricity that we're giving the electricity sector.
It's Daniel Simmons.
One of the important things to remember here is that there are impacts from wind, just like there are impacts from any other source of energy, and it's important to consider those impacts and figure out how we can minimize them in every whether it's wind, whether it's hydraulic fracturing and natural gas. People do see when there is change, people. We do have new impacts, and it's important to examine those impacts and see what we can do to minimize.
Bye. Let's go to Syracuse, New York. Brian, you're on the air.
Hello, can you hear me?
Certainly can, sir. Go right ahead.
Sure. My background is in environmental consulting, and I actually now teach at a local community college. And my basis for calling you guys up is, I don't think tax credits are the real issue. I think you just started touching on the real issue here, which is actually has to do with power lines and infrastructure, because most of the turbines that are going in upstate New York really have to do with actually power line location and have very little to do with actually the best locations for setting these turbines up. So, in terms of generating electricity. So I would actually encourage you to follow up with more questions on, what it would take to actually have the federal government or the state governments help us build more infrastructure for these for these new power structures, whether they're wind power or solar or other alternative energy.
All right, sir. Thanks for calling, John.
Well, I think that's right. It's a very relevant point that the cost of building the wind farm itself, that's one issue. How do we finance it? Tax credits, et cetera, is an interesting issue. But when you think about the infrastructure cost of building power lines from the so-called square states that are windy out to where the people are, that's a massive investment. And in fact, siting the wind farm itself has proven to be much easier than siting the transmission, which has been very, very difficult with no real solution on the horizon. Do the states control it? Do the feds control it? That's going to be a difficult issue.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Daniel.
And what's impressive about the United States is that we are, as John mentioned earlier, we have the second largest installed wind capacity in the world, but we're actually the world's largest wind producer because so far we've had good transmission to get that electricity to market. And in the future, we're going to have more and more wind capacity because in 29 states there is a mandate. There is a renewable electricity mandate. So we're going to have more and more wind. These issues are going to become bigger and bigger as we have more and more transmission to service all those new turbines that will happen regardless of whether there's a production tax credit.